Brad Inwood, Doing the Right Thing.
Thank you very much. And the subtitle is important, From Socrates to Cicero and Beyond. And let me start by saying that I don't often write or talk about any Platonic texts, which I will be doing today. So I feel I'm very much out of my depth, and this is very much a work in progress. I will, towards the end, as my subtitle indicates, try and bring this around to more familiar and comfortable territory. But let me begin. For many, if not most philosophers in antiquity, Socrates was clearly some sort of role model, even if, and sometimes because, his apparent philosophical commitments could seem paradoxical or extreme. To be sure, Epicurean hedonists didn't have much patience for idolizing Socrates, and even Aristotle and some of his followers could find fault here and there. But Cyrenaic hedonists, following Aristippus, and even cynical followers of Antisthenes and Diogenes looked back to Socrates with admiration as the founder of their own lines of work. Since Socratic books were written by a wide range of thinkers, later philosophers had a fairly generous range of images of Socrates to look back to and to look up to. From the Stoic point of view, as from ours, however, the works of Xenophon and Plato stand out as the main sources for their understanding of the thinker who perhaps, along with very few others, they regard as not just a philosophos, but as a sophos. There was a great deal to admire in Socrates, though not everyone would want to emulate those aspects of his life that led so decisively to his death. Despite what Aristophanes suggested in his parody and Plato strangely reinforced in the Phaedo, Socrates left no physical theory to inherit, except, if we believe Xenophon, a robustly theological teleology operating at a quite general level. There's little sign that any Socratics, except for Plato and some of his students, took up what they understood as the Socratic project in definition, and only academic skeptics embraced in a systematic way the Socratic ideal of confessing to one's own ignorance. No, for the most part, it was the practical and ethical Socrates who provided inspiration to later philosophers. And that's what interests me most today. But since Socrates was also the very model of a non-dogmatic thinker, it isn't obvious that his most important impact ought to have come through any doctrines he held about what to do, though he did, of course, announce ethical positions at certain key points. For the most part, at least in the works of Plato and Xenophon, the Socrates available for emulation is the character who asks questions and engages in conversations. We see him in action and committing himself to a practical project that came with certain quite real risks. He was the very model of a thinking person who illustrates how one might think critically about doing the right thing, even or perhaps especially in unusual and difficult circumstances. And that leads to my question. How does Socrates think we ought to decide what the right thing to do is in a given situation? And what part of the surviving Socratic literature can we turn to in order to find out? If we look at the Platonic dialogues, we see pretty quickly that Socrates is, for the most part, presented as being engaged in a settled pattern of actions, consistent in the pursuit of his mission, and seldom, it seems to me, overtly deliberating about next steps. Yet, according to Michael Stokes, in Dialectic and Action, we do have one dialogue as a resource that lets us see how Socrates thinks such consequential decisions should be approached. Stokes says that the Crito is the only representation we have of a deliberation by Socrates about, and I quote, a single specific practical and moral decision. In Crito, Socrates is put on the spot by his old friend. He must decide pretty much immediately whether to make his escape from prison. The issue is not in the least theoretical, nor is it primarily about the examination of someone else's views. As Crito says at 46a, so deliberate. Rather, it's no longer time for deliberation. The deliberation should be over by now. There's only one decision to make, since the whole plan must be executed tonight, says Crito. Now, Michael Stokes is not alone in thinking that those interested in Socratic decision-making, his approach to figuring out the right thing to do, have nothing but the Crito to consider. In what follows, I will certainly focus heavily on that dialogue, as it's by far the clearest example of Socrates himself coming to a specific practical decision. But I also think we can do a bit better. since the Apology also portrays Socrates making important specific decisions about how to defend himself. One's line of defense in a criminal trial is certainly a specific practical issue, and Socrates certainly treats it as a moral issue. He also gives us some pretty clear hints about how he came to the decisions that he made, both in his trial and in the various life decisions that got him into trouble in the first place. And we might find weaker hints elsewhere, as I'll suggest. My claim is going to be that when we put all of this together, as scanty as it may be, we do get enough evidence to enable us to see that Socrates operates by and illustrates a fairly clear theory of practical decision-making. Once I've sketched that, I'll go on to argue, briefly, that this Socratic approach to deliberation and decision-making was accepted as a model by at least some Stoics, one of the several schools of ancient philosophers that look back to Socrates as a model. Let me start out with a practical decision of apparently lower stakes than life and death. In the Protagoras, young Hippocrates comes banging on Socrates' door at an awkwardly early hour. He is excited and wants to learn wisdom from the itinerant sophist Protagoras, who's been in town for a couple of days, though Hippocrates only learned of it the night before. He has already made up his mind to sign up for the wisdom course, if possible, despite not yet having had the chance to see Protagoras or hear him speak. As the dialogue begins, he's made his practical decision already. Like many such decisions, including the one on the Crito, in fact, it comes with a monetary price tag. But Hippocrates has already worked out that problem. He just needs Socrates to make an introduction and possibly also a recommendation. Then he's all set to take action. It's worth noting that Hippocrates is instrumentalizing Socrates here, rather than asking him for advice. But that doesn't stop Socrates from examining him and in effect forcing Hippocrates to make the decision all over again, this time doing it right. So we stand to learn something here about how Socrates thinks important decisions ought to be made. As we follow the discussion, we should be able to see what Socrates thinks is important in such cases. The first phase of the conversation involves pressing Hippocrates on what he thinks he will learn from the wisdom course, in the sense of what he will become as a result of studying with Protagoras. Analogical reasoning suggests that he would be studying to become a sophist himself, but that isn't what Hippocrates actually wants. When offered the alternative suggestion, that he wants only to pick up some training that won't make him become something different from what he already is, but will just add some skills that are compatible with his remaining a gentleman, Hippocrates leaps at the prospect. But when pressed further about what skills a sophist has that he would impart to his student, the best he can come up with is the skill of clever speaking. Socrates follows up with the question, speaking about what subject? And at this point, Hippocrates hits the wall. I quote, "By God, I really don't know what to say." Classic aporia. So the first recommendation about procedural recommendation about practical decision-making can now be articulated. Before acting, understand, or at least have a view about, your goals in taking action and how the proposed action will get you there. This is a pretty elementary point about deliberation, but the eager and naive Hippocrates economically illustrates how easy it is to fail in this regard. It's not a trivial recommendation at all. Socrates follows up with an observation that, as we know from other dialogues, is typical of Socratic reasoning. The soul is more valuable than the body, and so it merits more care in deliberation, made explicitly at 313a to c. The payoff here is that Hippocrates would certainly agree that for decisions about the body, he would not submit to treatment before consulting with trusted and more experienced family members. And given the difference in value between body and soul, it's unreasonable that he should be ready to sign up with Protagoras without taking a similar precaution. A further comparison cements the point. In the case of bodily nourishment, one can buy the food and then deliberate afterwards before ingesting it. There's time for second thoughts and no potential loss except for the money, which Hippocrates, like Crito, is consistently not worried about. But with mental nourishment, the impact comes immediately upon purchase. So prior consultation with one's elders is all the more important. There are then two reasons for being more cautious about signing up for Protagoras' course in mental improvement than about anything affecting the body. Its higher value and higher risk. The plan then is to do this proper consultation before coming to a decision, both by having Socrates put Protagoras to the test on the points that matter for the decision, and possibly by talking to other wise people too and getting their advice. Further procedural recommendations emerge from the conversation. Second, apparently one should always consider the impact on the soul as more important than anything else. And third, when the stakes are high, consult with people who are more qualified than oneself before deciding. It's worth recalling that the examination of Protagoras is pretty much all that the rest of the dialogue consists in, that the other sophists do play a role in the conduct of the conversation, and that Socrates and presumably Hippocrates eventually leave at the end of the dialogue with no formal decision made. So it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the young enthusiast won't be joining the wisdom class after all. That's actually not made clear in the dialogue, but surely that's the case. So we can learn some things from this illustration of making what is, after all, a single, specific, practical, and moral decision, to quote Stokes again. That Socrates thinks you need to know what you're getting into, that you need to know your own goals well, and have carefully weighed the means to them, and that an inexperienced decision maker does well to consider not just the evidence about the way the plan of action will go, but also to take advice from wiser heads. And the soul should have more weight than anything else, especially the body, in one's deliberations. Now, none of these principles strikes me as particularly contentious, but they're also not trivial. Let's look at another dialogue with similar issues at stake, the Alcibiades. After some initial flirting, during which Socrates distinguishes Alcibiades' various gifts by kind: bodily gifts, he's a gorgeous, strong man; social and political gifts, he's well-born and well-connected; and mental gifts, he's a very sharp guy. Socrates then challenges the young man with the claim that he knows Alcibiades' ambitions better than Alcibiades himself does. Alcibiades grudgingly and hypothetically concedes that his goals are indeed what Socrates claims. And essentially, the claim is that his goals are political excellence in Athens, and after that, world domination. Quote, "But supposing I really do have these ambitions, how will you help me achieve them? What makes you indispensable?" Again, we notice a young advisee instrumentalizing Socrates, looking to Socrates in the first instance as a means to achieving an already established objective. They begin then with the specification of the goal and identification of Socrates as part of the means to that end. They agree that Alcibiades will start by advising the Athenian people, and then they go through a list of all the skills that Alcibiades has, on the basis of which he might advise them, and then some more that he doesn't have, on which they might need advice. It turns out that the Athenians' need for advice focuses on issues of war and peace, and that Alcibiades must admit that he does not yet know enough to advise on that topic. They agree that his objectives also involve a knowledge of justice. And then there's a lengthy discussion during which it emerges that Alcibiades doesn't have this knowledge either. Changing tack in a way that Hippocrates, being more naive, could not have done, the subtle Alcibiades suggests that it's knowledge of the advantageous that he needs to carry out his advisory role and begin his political career. It takes a while, all the way down to 116d, a long discussion, for Socrates to convince Alcibiades that he's already committed to the belief that true advantage is justice, so that he's right back to where he started from, since he doesn't know what justice is. And by 119a, Alcibiades has been forced to concede that he cannot learn what he needs to know from Pericles or any other Athenian political agent, since they're all completely incompetent. Now, this tempts Alcibiades to say that this might mean that he doesn't need to learn anything at all, since he has so much natural talent that he will surely triumph over his incompetent Athenian rivals. But Socrates soon has him convinced that his ultimate goal of world domination really does require education, since his formal rivals may well be more able than the weak domestic competition. And so he has to begin with self-knowledge. By 129a, the need for self-knowledge is finally agreed upon, and that turns out to involve knowledge of the soul, since that rather than the body is the real self. By the end of the dialogue, Alcibiades has finally agreed to become the student of Socrates, convinced that he has now discovered the means to achieve his goal of political success and world domination. Despite the apparent enlightenment that Alcibiades achieves by the end of the dialogue, we all know how this turns out, as we don't actually know how things turned out for Hippocrates. But despite the disastrous outcome of Alcibiades' career, we can extract similar lessons about practical decision-making from his conversation with Socrates. Alcibiades is deciding when and how to enter political life, but he doesn't know his true goals until Socrates exposes them. Nor does he understand the means to those ends at the outset. That's what they test as they go through the conversation. The entire dialogue is a struggle to get Alcibiades to see what means would in fact lead to his chosen ends. Though, of course, Socrates is pretty sure that pursuing those same means would very likely lead Alcibiades to in fact reconsider his goals. Not that that ever happens. The dialogue is, though, a complete failure, since Alcibiades turns out to be incapable of being honest with himself, no matter how hard he's pounded by Socratic questions. This very failure underscores the importance of two of the features of decision-making that we've already noted: the central importance of knowing one's own goals and of careful analysis of the means to that end. Along the way, we see reinforced the familiar Socratic principle about the relative importance of the goods of the mind to those of the body or other external goods. So, two examples. So far, we've seen Socrates working with other decision makers. But now we should consider how Socrates carries on when he has his own decisions to make. We turn to the Apology and then the Crito. In the Apology, Socrates either makes or talks about making several decisions. Let's look at some of them. When he first heard of the Delphic oracle's assessment of his wisdom, the result of Chaerephon's enthusiastic inquiry, he had to decide what to do. He chose to test the meaning of the oracle, and so began his mission as a gadfly in Athens. At 21b, he makes clear why he did this. First, he had enough self-knowledge to realize that the plain meaning of the oracle, that no one was wiser than he, was not true. Second, he was confident that the god did not lie. Even so, he could still have shrugged. He could have left it alone. But instead he, and I quote, tried to refute the oracle. The conclusion of his preliminary investigation, with this rather aggressive tone, trying to refute the oracle, was that he had the merely human wisdom of knowing that he knew nothing and was better off that way than if he in fact knew a little bit, like some people, but failed to recognize the limitations of his own knowledge. You would think then that he was done at that point. The interpretation of the oracle was in fact complete. In this first example of practical decision-making, Socrates manifests two general principles that he takes to be relevant to his action: that the god doesn't lie and is generally beneficent, especially to a good person, and that his own self-knowledge is fundamental to his decisions. In light of these principles, he decides that his definitely risky alenctic endeavors are worth the effort. It makes sense for him to want to understand the god's meaning because, we're supposed to infer, doing so will be beneficial to him. But once he's understood the oracle, he doesn't stop. Socrates recommits and decides to continue the mission even after the puzzle has been solved. So this is a new decision he has to make. He does not tell the court why, but we may make an inference from the fact that he sees this as a form of assistance to the god, as he puts it in 23b, that he takes himself to being commanded to perform, although we're not given any direct indication that that he actually was commanded. That's how he assessed the situation. Later in his speech, he refers to being stationed or placed on duty by the god, analogously to his assigned military service to the state. The underlying principle governing his decision is also stated there and again in 29b. He says, "It is wicked and shameful to do wrong, to disobey a superior, be he god or man." Before long, Socrates ranks the compulsive force of the orders of God and man when he places obedience to the god above obedience to the city, when he says, "I shall obey the god rather than you." Now, there are several general principles in play here, and elsewhere in the speech, others are set out. That the condition of one's soul is worth more than external goods, that the soul is worth more than the body, and consequently that death should be of no account compared to considerations of what is right or wrong when deciding what to do. Compatible with this are the claims that a better person cannot be harmed by a worse one, and that death, exile, or loss of civic privileges do not constitute genuine harm. Perhaps even more compelling is the principle that legitimate commands issued by a superior, in this case a god, must be obeyed. These principles stand behind the decision Socrates made to carry on with his mission, even after he had discovered the meaning of the oracle. And it did impose real costs on him. He attracted hostile attention from his fellow citizens. He was effectively removed from active political life. He was and remained poor, and he eventually earned the hostility of key members of his own community. In the narrative that he offers to confirm his long-term commitment to valuing justice above his own safety, Socrates recounts two episodes from his previous civic life. When serving on the Boulae, he refused to take illegal action against the generals who failed at Arginusae, and when ordered by the junta to arrest a fellow citizen, again contrary to the law, he simply refused. Either of those principled actions, which represent dedication to justice, could easily have led to his punishment or death. So, in view of such a clear commitment to justice and to obeying the god, over personal risk, active political life would, Socrates recognized, have led to his death. And so he stayed out of political life. Evidently, his own survival, though, does have some real value in decision-making. As he cites his own survival alongside his daimonion in order to explain his political stance. He says he stayed out of politics because participation would have led to an early death. Similarly, he admits at 34e that factors such as his age and his reputation, his persona in fact, have some weight in his deliberations. None of these considerations could outweigh justice, but it's important to emphasize that there are considerations that he gives attention to and have some weight. After his initial defense speech, undertaken in a defiant spirit, both because of his obedience to what he takes to be a divine command and because it's the greatest good for a human being to discuss virtue every day, Socrates has one more decision to make. His counterproposal for a punishment is, of course, deliberately provocative. But Socrates is not simply provoking the jury, he explains the principle on which he acts. At 37b and c, he explains why he cannot impose a significant penalty on himself because he's done no wrong, at least not knowingly. And so he won't ask for a fine or exile as punishment. Justice does not permit good to be recompensed with something bad. We should note here that extrinsic considerations like financial loss and exile are treated as being bad things, just as his life, his age, and his reputation have already been granted some deliberative weight. The principle is not that bodily and external factors do not matter in decision-making. It is merely that they have trivial weight when compared against the value of justice. In the Apology, then, we see Socrates making several particular decisions: to stay out of political life in general, to disobey authority if it involves committing injustice, to solve the riddle of the oracle, to carry on with his mission even after the riddle's been solved as an act of obedient service to the god. And he decided to risk conviction with a principled defense and to risk the death penalty through his bold counter-proposal. And in these decisions, we can discern some guiding principles. Despite the genuine value and relevance of bodily and social considerations, justice matters more. In fact, it's some kind of overriding factor. The god is truthful and beneficent. That one must always obey legitimate authority, whether divine or human, but that divine authority has more weight, and that human authority must yield before the value of either divine authority or just behavior. We might also ask where the Apology stands with respect to the principles that we noticed in the Protagoras and the Alcibiades. Some of the issues addressed there are not mentioned here because Socrates is making decisions for himself. He seems to know his own goals, to have relevant self-knowledge already, and to be very confident about means and reasoning relevant to those actions. Those principles were important to bring out for the moral neophytes that he advised in those dialogues, but Socrates is way past those concerns. He does, however, share the basic view about relative values. Virtue is so much more important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, overriding everything else, even though the value of the competing factors, life, prosperity, social relations, is real. And Socrates adds the convictions that one must always obey a competent authority, especially if it's a god. In Protagoras and Alcibiades, Socrates advises other people. Here, he's explaining his own decisions to act. Both situations let us see how Socrates decides how to do the right thing and what principles and procedures have guided him in that decision. Now, when it comes to the Crito, I want to acknowledge a very real debt to the work of Iakobos Vassiliou in his book Aiming at Virtue, which has really been the central thing that's affected the way I read the Crito. And so some of what I say about this is really just tracking that excellent discussion. And Vassiliou has shown, I think, that the Crito is the dialogue which really illustrates most clearly how Socrates thinks that one can and should make practical decisions. On that, of course, he would agree with Stoics. Where the principles on which one should act, against the background of which particular decisions wind up being made, are articulated with the greatest clarity. Now, some of these principles are substantive, and some are rather what we might call procedural principles. For example, at 44C and 46D, Socrates makes an emphatic point about the importance of following the views of qualified experts rather than the majority. The point is emphasized further in that Crito's common sense resistance to the principle has to be beaten down. This is complemented by the equally general claim that the majority can inflict neither harm nor benefit, since they can't affect one's wisdom. This, along with the principle that Socrates and Crito agree on, that is, that the basis of any decision process has to be justice, these seem to be what I would call substantive principles. Further substantive principles are quickly accepted by Crito, and they're the familiar ones that the soul is more valuable than the body, and that the good life is the just life. So none of these guiding principles for the deliberation which follows is at all surprising. The important point is how explicitly they're set out. Almost more important for their deliberations, though, is the procedural principle stated at 46B and C. And I'll read a short bit of text. It's not on the handout, something else is on the handout. He says, "We must therefore examine whether we should act in this way or not, as not only now, but at all times, I am the kind of man who listens only to the argument that on reflection seems best to me. I cannot, now that this fate has come upon me, discard the arguments I used. They seem to me much the same. I value and respect the same principles as before." And here's the part I want to emphasize. "And if we have no better arguments to bring up at this moment, be sure that I shall not agree with you, not even if the power of the majority were to frighten us with more boogies, as if we were children, with threats of incarceration, execution, and confiscation." The crucial point here is the resolution to stand by the results of prior successful arguments, unless and until a new and better argument comes along to displace it. This describes a form of what I might call dialectical conservatism. Once a point is argued for and accepted, it becomes the rational default, and it attains a privileged position in any subsequent deliberation. It is, of course, defeasible. It's not an axiomatic first principle, a point worth emphasizing if we want to understand the nature of Socratic deliberation, since there is a clear recognition that it could in principle be revised if certain conditions were fulfilled. But it has, nevertheless, the clear prerogative of controlling the deliberation despite other considerations that might be adduced. In this context, this gives the substantive principles that I talked about a minute ago an entrenched role in the discussion that follows. Previously, we agreed on these general principles, and they're locked in by the procedural principle. Now, this admittedly defeasible rational privilege is succinctly expressed by Socrates' statement at 47C. And if you'll pardon my pronunciation, I'll give you a bit of Greek. Epede or logos hutos haire, since the argument, and here is the classic problem, common problem of how to translate the word haire. And this matters since this clause expresses the power of the procedural principle in question. George Gruber, whose translation I'm following, undertranslate this word when he says, since our argument leads to this. Other translators make the simple mistake of rendering haire as choose, as though it were the middle voice, but it's not. That, of course, has the effect of making the force of the reasoning a basis for a mere preference and deprives it of any compulsive power. No, the sense of haire really matters here. The general sense of grasp, seize, take, conquer, win for this verb leads smoothly to the legal meaning to convict, in the sense of providing a decisive result in a legal situation. And that usage of haireo is found also in the Apology in Socrates' mouth at 28a. There, Socrates says that it is the prejudice against him rather than the arguments of believers that will haire him, that will get him, that will convict him, if anything does. And that clearly indicates an expected legal conviction. And so that's the kind of evidence that we have that lies behind the well-documented sense that you can find in LSJ, where haireo should mean to prove. And that sense is found in many authors from Herodotus to Plutarch, and in fact, fairly frequently in Plato. So despite that, I'm a little hesitant to embrace the translation prove here, since that term often entails some sort of irreversibility by argument. And Socrates clearly is leaving the door open to revision and to correction, given that he recognizes that the principles that Logos is working from could be altered in principle by further discussion. Instead, I think we might better translate this phrase, since our argument establishes this. What is established can be disestablished, whereas, to my ear anyway, real proofs are normally thought to be forever, permanent. You don't claim to have proven it until it's irrefutable. But whatever the translation, the point is that by Socrates' procedural lights, an agreed argument creates a clear and compelling, though defeasible prerogative that governs future reasoning. So once these substantive and procedural principles are agreed on by 48b, then the real deliberation begins. The first phase of the argument unfolds with astonishing speed and elegance, in large measure because the agreement on principles has effectively settled the question already. In brief, Crito and Socrates agree that harming anyone is unjust, and that this holds even when the other party has harmed or wronged you first. And harming is a form of injustice, so whatever else might have a place in our deliberations, and there are things with real value, such as death, poverty, the welfare of one's children, the invocation of justice is supposed to settle the debate. Interestingly, for the role of the procedural principle just discussed, at 49d and e, Socrates explicitly confirms Crito's previous commitment to the justice principle and asks him point blank whether he is still committed to it. The logos then remains established, and Socrates cares enough about the procedural principle that the to and fro with Crito makes it explicit in a way that it isn't always done in other dialogues. So all it's left to do at this point is to attempt to characterize the jailbreak as being an act of injustice against the city, which Socrates then aims to do by representing the escape as a form of promise breaking. Since Crito does not immediately know how to answer when he's asked whether he accepts that promise breaking counts as injustice, they still have some serious work to do to persuade Crito, and by implication the reader, that there would be harm done to the city by the breach of promise, which is arguably constituted by Socrates' escape. So Socrates then presses Crito on the question of whether this harm to the city would be justified by the fact that the city has harmed him first. Now, this is the very retaliation principle that they've already talked about. And despite that, And despite having rejected the idea that retaliation would justify doing harm to someone else, as recently as just a page ago, despite all of that, Crito jumps at the chance to accept this justification for helping Socrates to escape. Quote, "Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me and its decision was not correct? Shall we say that or what?" Crito responds, "Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that'll be our answer." So it's a forgetful and hasty reaction and reveals Crito's true feelings and also the flimsiness of his previous acceptance of the justice principle, as I would call it. That induces Socrates, that's actually why at this point, I think, Socrates invokes the personified laws of Athens in order to convince Crito that the promise breaking entailed by an escape really would be an act of injustice. People often talk about the two different arguments with two different speakers in the Crito, the Socrates-Crito debate and the speech of the laws. So this is a suggestion about why the laws come in here, precisely because of the Crito's wobbling on something that he'd already agreed on. So I don't want to go through the theory and arguments propounded by the laws. We can see, I think, already at this point where their discourse fits into the general structure of Socratic decision-making. The main burden of their argument is to establish how the particular case in hand relate to the principles that they've already agreed on. They do invoke some weaker subsidiary arguments aimed at Crito's less principled concerns as well, but the basic idea is that they've already agreed on the general principle that certain kinds of actions, if an action is characterized as unjust, it defeats everything else. But despite all of that, they still have to show that this particular case in question actually does count as an act of injustice. And that's the job of the laws to argue. So we have the separation of the generally agreed principle from the instantiation of that principle in a particular case where there is real room for debate, which is why the laws had so much work to do. The laws make their argument, and then there's a peroration, which summarizes various extrinsic factors and reasserts the justice principle, full stop, do not value anything else more than goodness. So much for the Crito. I think it's a particularly clear, though not unique example of the Socratic theory and practice of practical deliberation. And this kind of clearly articulated distinction between the principle and the application is what I want to focus on. And that's actually something which I'm going to bring out, I hope, as part of the Stoic theory of decision-making, which I will suggest they have adopted directly from Socrates. As committed Socratics, Stoics generally relied on a similar deliberative practice. For the most part, practical deliberation was taken to be about discovering what course of action would be appropriate or katheko in a given circumstance. Of course, it would be ideal if one could act virtuously, but only the actions of a sage are qualified as manifestations of virtue, since they are correct actions. But that doesn't really matter because one of these hypothetical correct actions that only sages can undertake is by definition a perfectly appropriate action, a teleon kathekon. So it's kind of okay. Planning to act virtuously then requires a prior deliberation about what is the appropriate thing to do. In effect then, in the Stoic framework, all deliberation by a morally serious person has to be focused on what is appropriate. And an appropriate action is itself defined quite crisply as an action which, when it's been done, admits of a reasonable defense, an eologos apologismos. The line of reasoning that leads to a decision to perform this or that token action in a particular situation will, in retrospect, constitute the reasonable line of defense or justification that confirms its status as being appropriate. So retrospective justification is supposed to map onto legitimate deliberative procedures. If we think of the ways that a given controversial action might be defended, we'll quickly realize that connecting the chosen action to accepted general principles so that it's plausibly an application of that general principle will normally suffice, absent countervailing considerations. And though it's surely not the case that every appropriate action has to be the result of explicit deliberation leading to it, after all, so many of our actions are carried out on the basis of habit or very fuzzy general policy. Nevertheless, an explanation of the way it's appropriate to have acted the way we did would normally demand that one be able subsequently to isolate the principles and considerations that make it reasonable, the sorts of considerations that would have been present in a deliberation if you'd actually carried it out consciously. So it's not hard to apply this understanding of actions to the situation of Socrates in the Crito. His decision to turn down the chance to escape is appropriate. And what the dialogue shows us, by way of his conversation with the resistant but good-natured Crito, is the line of reasoning which constitutes his justification, his apologismos. And indeed, there is a need for justification. Crito has made a case of sorts. He's claimed that it's reasonable, indeed necessary, to escape. Staying around in jail to be executed will, Crito has argued, inflict harm on Socrates' family and friends. It will, in fact, he says explicitly, Crito says it will be unjust if Socrates allows himself to be executed, especially in light of the agreed manifest unfairness of the verdict at trial. Socrates then has to show that it's reasonable to refuse to escape. Just as in the Phaedo, he is challenged to show the reasonableness of his own lack of fear and distress at impending execution. So to do this in the Crito, as we have seen, Socrates proceeds by stating general principles, and then he shows, either himself or through the laws, his imagined speakers, shows how his proposed action relates to the general principles clearly set forward. Stoics worked in a very similar way. As we can see, for example, in Cicero's De Officiis, on duties, a work dealing with the nature of appropriate action. In book 3, especially, and here there's a longish passage on the handout that I'll be talking about rather than reading through, but that's what I'm coming up to if you want to have a look at that. In book 3, we are treated to an imagined debate between two Stoic philosophers, Diogenes and Antipater, both of them presented as being able dialecticians. And the debate concerns the appropriateness of various courses of action in difficult or ambiguous circumstances. One of them is about a real estate transaction and how much information you have to provide to a buyer. And we'll come to that in a moment. As in the Crito, both interlocutors agree on the general principles. But unlike in the Crito, the argument or disagreement about what to do is more or less evenly matched. I mean, Socrates and Crito both agree on the justice principle nominally, but Crito thinks the justice principle means that he should be escape from prison and look after the interests of his family, and Socrates has a different view. Now, the argument there is quite asymmetrical. Socrates has intellectual firepower that is far beyond what Crito can muster. Whereas in the Stoic example, which I think is in some ways parallel to it, the situation is quite different. The two Stoics are pretty much evenly matched. Because the kinds of particular situations they're dealing with may connect with several different principles in such a way that what satisfies one principle might violate some other principle, the argument between these two Stoics turns on the relationships among the principles. Which principle has priority and under what circumstances, and on the way the principles might relate to specific facts. And so the long passage on the handout from book 3 of De Officiis is the major part of Cicero's presentation of the debate. And it's a question of whether or not this isn't the real estate, there's the real estate transaction and the cheap grain transaction. So situation quite simply is there's a grain shortage, people are starving, and someone is able to import large amounts of wheat, and the person who gets there first will get the best price for the wheat. And the question is, should the first merchant to pull into town let them know that there's a whole convoy of wheat ships coming behind and drive the price down, or should he just extract the highest price he can and then let everybody else take care of themselves? And Diogenes and Antipater disagree. Diogenes says, if you follow the letter of the law, you're cool. So you can get the high price. You don't have to tell anybody anything that they don't, strictly speaking, have a legal right to know. And Antipater takes the view that we have a general commitment to human well-being spread evenly across the population, so that it would be kind of wrong not to tell people that, yes, I've got a bunch of wheat for you, but don't worry, there's more coming, so I'll cut the price. Now, Cicero takes Antipater's side in this and similar debates. And at the end of this passage, Cicero comments, you will note that throughout this debate, there's nobody saying, although what I'm proposing to do is shameful, still I'm going to do it because it's to my advantage. Rather, one person says that it's advantageous in a way that is not in fact shameful. On the other side, the claim is that it should not be done precisely because it is shameful. So what they agree on is you don't do anything unjust, you don't do anything shameful. They just have to apply that to the specific case. How does the notion of shamefulness as a banned characteristic of an action relate to the very specific situation that we find ourselves in here and now? The application of principles which does all the work. In the Crito, I think the situation is similar. The responsibility to care for one's children is a valid and reasonable principle. So is concern for the well-being and feelings of one's friends. Taken alone, those factors might well make it reasonable for Socrates to escape. Yet one also has, Socrates argues, a responsibility to stand by the terms of one's bargains, whether explicit or implicit. Socrates successfully argues that the agreed overriding principle defeats all other considerations. In the De Officiis, things are more complicated since Cicero wants to show the complexity of moral decision making, and he also wants Antipater to come out as the winner in the debate. The relative weighting of principles about private property and the general concern for human solidarity, that is something that one might have a reasonable debate about. And Cicero shows us that, well, in the end, shows us just how complex that is. And in the end, he makes it clear that he himself prefers, for good reasons, Antipater's view. It's possible to imagine a version of the Crito in which a skilled dialectical opponent could have convinced Socrates to put the human solidarity of family and friends ahead of his implicit promise to Athens and her laws. But that's not the decision for which Plato wished to show the reasonable justification. And that no doubt explains to some measure why Plato chose an interlocutor as weak dialectically as Crito was. So agreement on high-level principles, but serious case-specific deliberation about how those principles should be applied to particular cases, that's the general framework for Stoic deliberation. And it came, I suggest, straight from Socrates. There's another well-known example. This one's from Epictetus, and that's the longer passage in the handout. This is a Discourse 122, which talks explicitly about various preconceptions of moral relationships, and says that the sum and substance of moral deliberation is the application of the preconceptions to particular cases. And he gives a number of examples of that, kind of vividly illustrating it. The mutual conflict among people, end of section 3, comes from the application of preconceptions to particular things. So we all agree that nobility is important, but what does nobility consist in here and now? That's where Achilles and Agamemnon disagree. In section 9, what is education? Education is a matter of learning to apply our natural preconceptions to particular circumstances in a manner that accords with nature. In section 17, the fact that this is all about practical decision-making is emphasized. So what should we do? That is the quest of someone who pursues philosophy genuinely and is in labor with his thoughts. What do we do in terms of making practical decisions in the context of agreed general principles? And that's the focus for that handout. So this point, what should we do, is, I think, what I really want to extract from this. This is a text about practical decision-making, and I think it's quite comparable to the kind of thing we see in the Crito. This is the sort of thing that, as Epictetus says, philosophers focus on. It's what their minds are in labor over. And I think that's that language of labor is a clear Socratic allusion to Symposium 206. And also in the passage, there's a reference towards the end about someone who wastes their time on philosophy being like a little boy and he should grow up. Another clear allusion to the Gorgias. Okay, so once they settle their general principle, they have to debate on particular cases. There are a number of points of similarity to Socratic dialogue, but I think the Crito is lurking in the background. So Socratic deliberation differs only slightly from its Stoic descendant. Both versions agree that virtue or justice override all competing considerations. Socrates will label both virtue and its competitors as goods. So the Stoics put it slightly differently. The non-virtue considerations that matter are labeled by Stoics preferred indifference, not lesser goods, but the relationship between the two kinds of considerations is exactly the same. Non-virtue goods, Socrates, preferred indifference, Stoics, they matter, but they're always overridden by virtue. In any concrete action context, the job of a clear thinker is precisely to apply general principles to the case in hand and then to stick to it in action. We need to see where justice lies. Does it lie in consideration for the welfare of one's children or with the keeping of promises? Does it matter that one has previously been mispleased by the other party or not? And so forth. The ability to deliberate in this way is what, according to both Epictetus and Socrates, that's what education is all about. This is what Epictetus emphasizes and what Socrates both models in his own actions and tries to inculcate in those of his interlocutors who are facing decisions in their own lives, Hippocrates and Alcibiades, for example. And in the application to cases, one of the factors that bears on the issue will normally be what Epictetus calls the role of the agent, the persona, the prosopon, and what Socrates alludes to when he mentions in the course of his debate with Crito his parental status, his age, his calling as a philosopher, and so forth. So I don't want to go on about the importance of roles in Epictetus' notion of decision-making, but it is worth noting that attention to that kind of factor is in fact recognized by Socrates as well. It crops up again explicitly in Seneca's book-length examination of moral deliberation, letters 94 and 95, where Seneca explores the function of the general principles of ethics, the decreta, and more specific injunctions tied to situations and roles, praecepta. I just want to observe that in the artificial debate that Seneca sets up there is no disagreement about the basic structure of deliberation. Both sides think that deciding on what the right thing to do is involves applying general principles to one's situation in light of one's role. Without the general principles, one's moral reasoning would go adrift. Debate only arises because one party thinks that you don't need intervening generalizations to help you do the deliberating. So I should conclude. There's a sense in which what I've been talking about hasn't really accomplished much this afternoon. Who, after all, doubted that the Stoics were fundamentally Socratic in their approach to ethics? And who doubted that Socrates decided what to do with his life on the basis of principles? So at that level, what I've done for the last 40 minutes is just state the obvious. But I hope it has been of some use and interest to see, if I'm right, that the Platonic Socrates provided a more specific model of how such decisions should be made, of the way that principles play out in practical situations, and of how a reasonable justification of one's decisions can and should be given. And that this more specific model is replicated in its essentials in the Stoic theory of deliberation about the right thing to do in specific cases. That is, in their theory of kathekonta, appropriate actions. The Crito is clearly the best literary instantiation of this Socratic practice. And that may well be the reason why this dialogue was of such particular interest to Seneca, who mentions it a couple of times, and especially to Epictetus, and I would wager to many other Stoics as well. Okay, and that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. I'll clap on behalf of a large number of muted people. We'll now begin the discussion period. It's those of you who've been to these before know I'll moderate. To ask a question or make a comment, please click the raise your hand button. That's the technique that we use. If you have trouble with the raise your hand button, as people sometimes do, send me a private chat or send an email to socratessociety@rice.edu. I'll be monitoring both the chat and that email account during the session. Please we're a large group, please keep your questions concise. So now we'll begin. Merrick Anderson.
Hi, Brad. How are you? Can you hear me?
All right. I can hear you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you. So I have a couple questions, but I'm going to ask one just now to keep things short. And that's just, I wonder, I mean, I like this very much, and I found it illuminating in many respects. I wonder just about one sort of very conspicuous aspect of Socrates' decision-making procedures that we find in a lot of dialogues that you didn't mention, and that is, of course, his divine sign, which pops up, you know, in the Euthydemus, in the Apology, in the Republic. He says it's actually why he continued in the practice of philosophy, right? And it looks, I mean, at least on some sort of crude interpretation of what's going on there, that it acts like a deliberative trump card for him, right? Anytime it pops up and says do X, he does it, or don't do X, he doesn't do it. And I just wondered how this sort of fits into the model you've articulated, and particularly whether or not you think this is going to fall under some sort of rational principle that can ultimately be defended, right? Because, you know, arguably, some people might think this is not the sort of thing that admits a rational defense. I mean, maybe it does, but, you know, it's at least unclear how this is going to fit into the system. So I wanted to ask about that.
Good, thank you. I actually made one glancing reference to the divine sign, but you're absolutely right. I have not taken this into account as part of my somewhat artificially constructed model, and I should, and I think it'd be helpful. I think Socrates says at one point that what the divine sign does is say no. It's a trump card in the sense that it's a veto rather than providing positive command. And I think actually I should factor this in, and I thank you for the suggestion. So thinking of it as a veto, I would want to put it in the category of a prior constraint. In other words, there's a background constraint, just as you might imagine other kind of deliberative situations where, I mean, I might have a background constraint that I would never, whatever else I had to do, I wouldn't work on the Sabbath. That's a background constraint. And I might do all kinds of other deliberating and come to a decision, and then somebody says, oh, it's the Sabbath, and you're done, you're shut down. So I think that kind of role is something we can identify and recognize in deliberative context. I don't know whether it's plausible to say that it represents something which is rationally workoutable. If I had to guess, I would say Socrates probably didn't think so, because he would have put it in rational terms if he thought it was rational. But if it's divine, and if you think the divinities are rational, you might take the view that I think is, actually, let me be more positive. Let me suggest that Socrates thinks it's rational, but he can't know the reasons. He has faith that the divine veto is well grounded. He just happens not to have access to the grounding. That's what I would guess he would say.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Evan Rodriguez.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad, for the talk, and good to see you. So I had just a quick friendly suggestion, and then a question about kind of the deliberative context and involving other people in deliberation. So the friendly suggestion, I was just trying to think of other Platonic contexts where Socrates is engaged in practical advice, and the Laches was another one that, you know, I might have missed it, but I didn't hear you talk about too much, but I think fits very well with the sort of picture you were setting out. And there's that same point made as in the Crito about how, you know, you got to seek experts when you don't know yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that all fits very nicely with the picture you were giving. Another example that came to mind that brings up for me this question about involving others in the deliberation, or when you can do it on your own and when you have to consult other people, is the symposium. There's this, humorous deliberation that happens towards the end of the symposium that Alcibiades reports when they're talking about whether or not they should sleep together. And Alcibiades says, okay, I've made my decision. I'm kind of ready. Now time for you to make your decision. Socrates makes a comment about having to think about the relative value of what's being offered here, which again, very much in line with the sort of picture you were giving. But a curious thing that I don't entirely know what to make of is he suggests, well, from now on, let's make these decisions together. He sort of uses this dual and says we have to make these decisions together. And I wonder whether you think that's an essential part of deliberation. I mean, we see Socrates always deliberating with other people, or just kind of a mere feature of the mode of presentation of the dialogues.
Thank you for the two suggestions. I think I'm not surprised there's things I hadn't thought of. It's really helpful. But what standing does doing it together have? So in the Crito, there's also an emphasis put on wanting to work this out as it were collegially. It's what we have agreed upon together is what creates the binding nature of the conversation going forward. So I would like to put that in the context of a larger factor about Socratic dialectic, that there are interlocutors with whom Socrates recognizes he can have a fruitful exchange, although they might disagree, because there's some general principles they agreed on, people like Glaucon and Adeimantus. And there are people with whom he realizes that one cannot in the end have a fruitful dialectic because they don't share general principles of procedure or substance, people like Thrasymachus and Callicles. And I think some of there are places where Plato directs the reader's attention to the contrast between different kinds of interlocutors that Socrates has. And I think in the Republic case, even specifies that there's enough that they agree on that they can have this disagreement and have it be productive. So I think I would like to put it in terms of the dialogical situation rather than a general principle on deliberation. But that might be wrong. It might be that it should also be put in terms of an actual preference for joint deliberation. That's a really interesting thought. I'm not sure whether I want to sign on for that or not. Because if you had the wrong kind of interlocutor, joint deliberation would fail. And ultimately, if it's a decision that affects your life and death, you, the agent, have to come to the decision. So yeah, I'm still a bit at sea on that. It's a good thing for me to think about. Thank you.
Fabio Morales.
Yes, thank you very much for your illuminating talk. In those debates where the two speakers share common principles, can one say that they're discussing about the means to reach the proposed goal? Like, let's say, if the goal is justice, they are trying to find out what the just action would be in this case, and then they wouldn't be really thinking just about means in the usual sense of the word. They would be configuring the goal itself, wouldn't you say?
Good. In laying this out, I was fairly loose about the talk of means and instruments, and I guess I should clarify. I had in mind something more like in Aristotle when he talks about the telos and ta prosto telos, the things that contribute to the telos, which are more than just independently identifiable instruments to achieving a fixed goal, but the considerations that bear on the telos, which can include refining your conception of the telos. So I think I would be happy to be a little more inclusive about what would count as the things contributed to this debate, not just independently identifiable, external, in a separate box kind of instruments, but rather also including considerations that would reshape your conception of what justice consists in.
Thank you very much.
I think I would welcome that. Yeah.
Thomas Sleiban.
Hi, Brad. Good to see you again.
This really is old home week, Thomas. It's good to see you all. So many old friends I'm seeing here today.
So I just wanted to build on Merrick's question about the place of the daimonion. I was wondering about the place of commands of the gods more generally. And I'm not sure that your idea that we should see obedience to the gods as just a sort of background constraint in the form of a veto as properly taking into account all of the evidence that we get in the Platonic dialogues. So I was particularly struck by the fact that a lot of the examples you were pointing to in the talk either begin or end with the gods seeming to issue positive injunctions of one form or another, or at least doing more than being a sort of background veto constraint. So the first Alcibiades only happens because Socrates comes to think that the god has decided that it's time for Alcibiades and Socrates finally to talk. Even though that's going to be happening by way of the daimonion, we might see that as being something of a positive demand. But more pressingly, in the Crito, it's important, I think, to remember that it's a conversation with the divine laws, such that at the very end of the dialogue, there's that very weird bit about the argument drowning out all other arguments, like the cries, the Corybants, that again doesn't just sound like a sort of background veto constraint or something of the sort. There's a stronger role for the divine injunction there, potentially. And then the Phaedo at the very beginning, the idea that the reasonableness of Socrates' decision to commit suicide is only going to be the case if God is on board with this and thinks this is best for him, right? Which again seems to be something like we need to take the desires of the gods as a sort of macroscopic guiding principle rather than just a background veto constraint. And so I was wondering if we might think that there are actually two primary guiding background principles. One, always do what is virtuous and just, and then two, always do what the gods demand of us. And that second addition would actually, I think, be very much in keeping with at least Epictetus's Stoic appropriation of his Socratic heritage. Insofar as for Epictetus, obedience to the commands of the gods is going to be one of the central ethical obligations that we have as human beings.
Good. That's a lot to digest. Let me just back up one step a little bit here before so in responding to Merrick, he asked specifically about the daimonion. And I think I would say that if not always, then in the vast majority of cases, the daimonion does function as a veto. And I didn't mean to make that a general claim about all interaction with divine preferences. What I did focus on was Socrates' rank ordering of the compulsive force of different commands. Divine commands trump human commands. Even when the human commands are legitimate authority, God wins. So I think in general, I would agree that when Socrates can detect an unambiguous divine command, he will take that as an overriding reason, more than just a veto. Absolutely. What strikes me with the Apology, though, is that as I read it, it takes Socrates, a lot of substantial interpretation by Socrates to generate a divine command out of that situation. All we really have from the god is this oracular, opaque claim about how smart he is. And Socrates, pretty much in his own hook of interpretive effort, converts that to a command. Once he comes to construe it as a command, he endows it with all the authority that commands have. But I think it's striking that it's not an unambiguous case of a divine command. And I would say the same thing about the Corybantic passage at the end of the Crito, which I sure don't understand yet, and haven't read anybody who's convinced me that they do. I don't think that the Corybantic hymns with all of their racket constitute the voice of God. I think that's whatever else is going on. That seems to me to be helping out the case a little too much. But you're right. I should allow for, especially in considering the Stoic reception of this, more positive divine input. If only because, to be sure, we only have anecdotes. One thing we do see in the story of Zeno's suicide is the interpretation by Zeno that such and such an event constituted a command from God that it was time to go, right? And that I think is kind of reflecting Stoic reception of the Phaedo. I think you're quite right to point to the Phaedo. So revisiting this and thinking about where positive preferences of the gods fit in, that I think Phaedo then becomes, even though it's not really a suicide, as you may have unintentionally said, it was certainly construed as being a suicidal course of action in the later tradition. So yeah, I really have to think about that. That's good.
Phil Nitzis.
Even more old home. I'm afraid Thomas pretty much anticipated much of what I was going to say, but a couple of things, because when you were first presenting it, you were presenting it sort of as if Socrates was working on principles that he had established through dialectic. Whereas when you're looking at the Stoics, whatever Antipater and Diogenes can be arguing about, they're not going to be arguing about establishing principles established by God. So they're going to be arguing about interpretation, the application of the principle. So that's one way I thought that, am I breaking up? I have another unstable connection, unfortunately. That's one way I thought there was this analogy between the kind of divine nature of Stoic principles and then the sort of Socratic principle that he claims to be at least making his decision about. That it's principle that, as you said, is revisable. Whereas none of the Stoic principles are revisable like that. So there's this analogy in the strength of the principle people think they're working on. So that's one place where I thought the deliberative context could be very different. Now, when the Stoics are looking back, I mean, you remember the old Dudley paper about, the way the Stoics interpreted the divine dream, and so they took the divine dream as some kind of divine indication that Socrates' principle is more than just established, but it's divine. So I think, when you were saying how, well, you need to look at the way the Stoics are really taking this on and giving them interpretations, but they're essentially taking what you might say principles that are established through Socratic dialectic and then raising them up to these more divine principles.
Good. So Phil,
and then just one side note about the daemonians. Yeah, I mean, it's really odd that he never decides that he has to test the daemonian. He's gonna test, Apollo or the oracle, but he's not going to test his own daemonian, which is, it's only has veto power, but it vetoes some pretty big things like not entering into politics and living a normal kind of life. And then he doesn't test that seems very problematic.
Good. So Phil, I think I got about 50% of that. Unfortunately, but as usual, 50% of what you say is worth 100% of most other people, so I'll take it under consideration. Don, I'm not sure, David Gallup may have been putting up a physical hand, is that right? Don's still muted.
Why don't you finish answering, Phil, and then we'll.
Well, as I said, I got about 50% of it, and I think it was it added up to two things, and maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that there are significant disanalogies between the Stoics and Socrates on some important points about the revisability of considering the principles, and I do agree with that. What I would point out, though, is that you could take, say, the Epictetus passage. given that we've got, I guess the fact that he makes the principles preconceptions that we have by nature is what locks them in, rather than the fact that they're divine commands. Of course, they're divinely supported, naturally, like anything about human reason. So that does make it less open to continuing dialectic than Socrates purports to be. So that isn't just disanalogy which needs to be allowed for. I quite agree with that. I think some of what you said about the daimonion in particular was lost in the transmission. So maybe you could send me a note about it separately, and I'll.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. It's easier.
Yeah, that would help. Thank you.
Joy, would you unmute David Gallup, please?
Can you?
Oh, he's muted again.
Unmute him again.
Can you hear?
Joy, we need to have David Gallup unmuted and stay that way.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute.
Oh, there you are, David. Don't change anything. You're good.
Am I here? Am
You're
I
in.
on now? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good to see you after so many years.
Indeed.
Yeah. On this question of God and the role of God, I wonder if it's significant that the very last words at the end of the Crito are that the God points out the way. And that comes on top of the whole sequence of complex argument in which Socrates has shown through the words of the laws his own rational intellect operating on this question of whether it would be right for him to escape. And I think one could say that there's not really, in Plato's mind anyway, a distinction between what God ordains and what his intelligence, properly trained and focused, can do, that the result of his intelligent thinking, according to Nous, will produce the result that God wishes him, if there is God, wishes him to perform. So that it's misleading to think of God as a sort of separate authority here. He is obeying God precisely insofar as he uses his intellect in the way that the dialogue has just demonstrated. And as evidence for that, I would suggest that we pay attention to the distinction drawn at the beginning between, or near the beginning, between what most people might think and what the expert man would say in dealing with this question. Who is this man, this expert? Surely he is the person whose workings of whose mind are displayed in everything that will follow. In other words, the workings of Socrates' rational intellect, which is in a way, as I've just suggested, the working of God within him. So this antithesis that some of the questioners have suggested between God and some other source of guidance is actually mistaken.
Thank you. I take the spirit of that to be some kind of support for my general approach. But I mean, I'm all in favor of a reading of Plato, certainly in these dialogues, and many other Greek and Roman thinkers, which treats the convergence of the rational and the divine, essentially, which is a extremely common tendency, as being a divinization of the rational. So the daimon, the inner divinity, which later Stoics talk about so much, I think is not to be set in contrast to our reasoning, but rather as an embodiment and a dignification of our reasoning. I'm in general quite in favor of that broad line of interpretation. I do think, though, there are cases where there's a recognition that there might be a normative order which has features that are beyond the current thinker's capacity to understand because they're too large and too complex. I'm not at all sure that that actually infects Socrates himself as presented by Plato, but certainly in later Stoic reception of these ideas, you get a recognition that there's a divinely structured big picture which the thinker knows is rational even though they cannot comprehend the details. This is very, very clear in Marcus Aurelius, and there, I think it's recognized by Epictetus as well, and of course here lie the antecedents of later struggles with theodicy in the later tradition. So I think there is a place for that in the story that I would want to tell about the relationship between the divine and the rational, which I think ultimately goes back to a very common earlier Greek recognition that human reason has its limits, and that we do well to recognize what those limits are. This, if not in Homer, then in Xenophanes, and in Socrates' own recognition of how little he knows. So I think there is, as it were, space made for confidence that the divine is rational, but a recognition that we may not be able to get the details. So we can keep the convergence on the theoretical level, but in practice, one might have to yield. So I'll take most of what you have to say, but the slight side constraint. Thank you.
All right, well, we're essentially out of time. Let's thank Brad again. I'll make noise on behalf of all the muted people for a splendid occasion.
Well, thank you all very much. It's wonderful to see so many old friends, even if they're merely names on the screen, and to hear from so many of you as well. I'm really grateful for the opportunity and for your suggestions for further development. Thank you.